One of the most watched and controversial films ever made in human history is a 59-second home video shot in Northern California. The film, which was recorded on October 20th, 1967, claims to contain footage of Bigfoot, leading to a war of theories between believers and skeptics alike. For more than half a century, experts from various fields, including primatology, special effects, biomechanics, anthropology, paleontology, and zoology, have thoroughly scrutinized every single frame of this video. And yet, to this very day, no one has been able to successfully debunk this footage 100%. Roger Patterson, the filmmaker, not only passed a lie detector test, but also went down to his grave vehemently denying that his movie was a hoax. Bob Gimlin, Patterson's friend and co-producer, has also denied being involved in any hoax. And yet, in light of all of these facts, to this day, the debates continue to rage. Does the Patterson film show Bigfoot, or was this just a man in an ape costume? 57 years later, the jury is still out. Bigfoot myths have been around since the earliest civilizations of man. For instance, ancient Sumerian texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh speak of the Enkidu, a hairy monster-like creature with immense strength, which sounds a lot like the Bigfoot we now know. Perhaps the Enkidu was an ancestor? Anyway, I digress. The main character in our story today, Roger Patterson, entered into the Bigfoot subculture sometime in the early 60s. Famed author Ivan Sanderson had just published his work on Yeti, entitled Abominable Snowman: Legend Come to Life. And in just a few months, Patterson had read the encyclopedic material and was so captivated by it that he made up his mind to find the elusive Bigfoot. Between 1962 and 1964, Patterson made 2 trips to Bluff Creek, an area in California where Bigfoot is rumored to frequent. On each of these trips, Patterson, who used to be a rodeo and amateur boxer, claimed to have seen fresh tracks of the legendary Bigfoot. These finds boosted his motivation, and he committed even further to discovering Bigfoot itself. An ambition that came at great cost, disappointments, and ridicule to him. At first, Patterson was able to rally fellow thrill-seekers to go hunting down Bigfoot with him. However, with each setback and no-shows, one by one, these individuals dropped out of the venture. That would have been enough to discourage the average person, but Patterson was no average person, so he continued his search. Then, come October 1967, the hunter's perseverance was rewarded. This time, Patterson went down with his skeptical but supportive friend, Bob Gimlin, and the two packed up a couple days' worth of provisions and went down to the forest using Gimlin's truck and 3 horses. After a few days in the forest, in the afternoon of October 1967, the 2 men were riding upstream in a northeasterly direction when they stumbled on something that would change their lives and perhaps the course of history forever. At about 1:15 p.m., beside the creek, Patterson and Gimlin spotted a figure crouching low behind a crow's nest. The creature was bipedal and ape-like, standing at 6 to 7 feet in height with brownish hair, the exact physical descriptions of Bigfoot. Moreover, this creature featured prominent mammary glands, leading the duo to believe that they were very likely looking at a female Bigfoot. But could it actually be? Was this Bigfoot? The very same Bigfoot of legendary fame, just wandering through the woodlands of California? With no time to wonder about that, the 2 immediately started rolling. It took quite a few stumbles finding the right angle to get a perfect film of said mysterious creature. But in the end, Patterson managed to capture what has now become one of the world's most controversial films to date. A film that shot Bigfoot into the limelight. original footage of Patterson-Gimlin film has been lost and only copies now remain. Nevertheless, debates abound. In the video, Patterson is standing at a distance of about 80 feet from the mysterious creature, and the alleged Bigfoot is walking across a clearing before it disappears into the dense forest. Now, you can't see this because the film runs out before Patterson can record it. But after the creature disappears, Gimlin mounts his horse and tries to follow her, but Patterson calls him back because he's alone on foot without a rifle, and he fears the creature's mate might return and try to hurt him. So, Gimlin turns back and the creature wanders off, never to be seen or heard from again to this very day. Patterson's film ran out after the creature wandered off, which was somewhat serendipitous. The entire adventure with stumbling on the alleged Bigfoot hardly lasted up to 2 minutes, but the duo figured it wasn't enough to simply have video evidence of the creature. This being, whom they named Patty, had left footprints, and Patterson needed every bit of evidence he could get if he was going to substantiate the incredible claim he was about to announce to the whole world. The claim that he had found Bigfoot. So, after making their film, Patterson and Gimlin returned to their campsite, picked up some plaster, and then returned to the site of their encounter to make 2 plaster casts of the best quality right and left footprints. These casts, along with the now famous iconic look-back frame 352, have become the subject of the most intense scrutiny as believers and skeptics alike work diligently to validate or debunk Patterson's encounter. The result is a continuing debate between the 2 main camps. On the one hand are the believers who claim that Patterson and Gimlin saw something real. On the other are the skeptics who remain unconvinced. As far as they are concerned, this was just a man in an ape costume and nothing more. Now, which of them is right? That's what we're about to find out. Even though all believers are generally in consensus that Patterson and Gimlin encountered something mysterious in that forest, they do not all agree on what exactly that mystery being is. In fact, many theories have been proposed within the believers' camp in an attempt to explain what Patterson and Gimlin captured in their 59-second film. Some have said that the duo simply misidentified a known animal, like a bear, and then proceeded to interpret their sighting as Bigfoot simply because they were so desperate to find the mythical creature. However, as you'll see when we begin to uncover the lines of evidence from experts who have studied this film, this theory does not seem likely. It's probably even the weakest one out there. Another theory claims that Patterson and Gimlin really did stumble on an unknown species, maybe even a cryptid. Holders of this theory claim that the creature sighted was probably a remnant member of an extinct genus of apes known as Gigantopithecus. But this species went extinct about 300,000 years ago, and no fossil of said species has ever been found in the Americas. Plus, Bigfoot shows some relation to humans, while Gigantopithecus has no relationship to humans whatsoever. You've probably also heard the theories that Bigfoot is probably an extraterrestrial, but this has more to do with the myth of Bigfoot as a whole rather than the Patterson-Gimlin film, so we won't be looking into that either. The biggest debate on the Patterson-Gimlin film has been between those who believe that Patterson actually recorded footage of Bigfoot and those who don't believe so. So over the next couple of minutes, we're going to go through their lines of evidence, and then you can let me know what you think down in the comments. To begin with, I think it's strongly to Patterson's credit that his film has still not been successfully debunked even after all these decades, especially with the dizzying advancements in technology. Of course, the footage has not been successfully authenticated either, but still, that fact alone says a lot. Perhaps the most comprehensive attempt at debunking the Patterson-Gimlin film comes from author Greg Long. Long's arguments are detailed in his 2004 book, The Making of Bigfoot, The Inside Story, where he categorically states that the Patterson film is an elaborate hoax. First, Long reveals that the alleged Bigfoot in Patterson's film is not Bigfoot, but a man in an ape suit by the name of Bob Hieronymus. According to Hieronymus, Patterson and Gimlin had approached him in July or August of 1967 and told him to help them fake the Bigfoot film by putting on a costume. In exchange, the duo were prepared to pay him $1,000 and then give him more money if they ever made money from the film. So why did Hieronymus decide to rat his partners out after 37 years? Well, according to him, Patterson and Gimlin never paid him per their agreement. Hieronymus went further to claim that the costume was bulked up with football paraphernalia. Football shoulder pads were added to the shoulders, and the headpiece was actually a dressed-up football helmet. As for the breasts, Hieronymus said that it was Patterson who decided to add that bit to the costume. Hieronymus also claimed that on the day of the shoot, he was told to stand in one place and not move until he got a signal from Patterson, which was precisely what he did, leading to the hotly debated film the world hasn't stopped talking about. Long's second prominent witness is the alleged costume maker Philip Morris. Morris claimed that he was the one who made and sold the gorilla suit to Patterson at $435 plus shipping. According to Morris, Patterson had asked him for ideas on how to make the arms look longer, to which Morris responded by telling him to slip a shovel handle or a stick into the sleeves. Morris also alleged that he was the one who gave Patterson ideas on how to bulk up the suit with football gear. Now, all of these points sound very convincing, until you start to analyze them and they begin to fall apart one after the other. Morris and Hieronymus made rather huge claims about the Patterson-Gimlin film, but can they substantiate these claims? Let's explore. First off, the suit itself is nowhere to be found. There's also no receipt, no scraps of material left, no sketches, nothing. It's just the word of these two men and a few other extras with no tangible evidence to present. In fact, when we begin to examine both men's claims about the supposed suit, many inconsistencies and contradictions appear, which ultimately render both confessions inadmissible. For instance, Morris claimed he made his suit out of Dynel, a synthetic nylon material. Hieronymus, on the other hand, claimed that the suit was made from synthetic fur and the pelt of a dead horse, and that it stank. These are wildly different claims, and you can't say that Hieronymus was simply unfamiliar with the material, because he did mention that this costume stank. And when you think about it, a stinky suit makes sense with the pelt of a dead horse. If Hieronymus is trying to sell Long a fake story, and he's claiming that the costume is made from the pelt of a dead horse, it makes sense to add the bit about the costume being stinky because it helps his story. What doesn't make sense is how it can still be true that it was Morris who made the costume. Because if Morris was the one who made the suit, as he claims, and if he used Dynel, then there's hardly any reason why the resulting costume should stink. At least not like a dead horse. Hieronymus and Morris's claims are both contradictory, and therefore are automatically debunked on that count. Second, looking at the creature in the suit alone, the man in a suit theory immediately becomes suspect. The obvious musculature, for one, makes the suit claim questionable. If this was just a man in a suit, then the muscles shouldn't be that defined. We should see creases and folds where the knees flex as the man moves. But we don't see that at all. The knees flex and the muscles are well defined. If this was merely a costume, then it's not just super impressively authentic for its time, it's also super authentic for our time. Consider the ape costumes used in the newly released Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, for instance. This is a 2024 movie, made at a time when CGI exists, and it still comes nowhere close to the authenticity we see in the Patterson film. I mean, take a look at this. Keep in mind that Morris was one of the top suppliers of ape costumes to Hollywood at the time, which raises multiple issues. If Morris did indeed make a costume this realistic, why didn't we see more Hollywood ape movies with super authentic costuming? Especially considering the claims that he was a top Hollywood costume supplier. And how come nearly 60 years later, with the benefit of the dizzying rate of technological advancements we have now, we still haven't been able to meet up with that quality of authenticity? More to the point, how come Morris made such a realistic-looking suit just once and then went back to making subpar costumes after that one? That seems strange. Plus, if you were wondering, Morris did try to recreate the suit, and this was the result. Morris's recreation is so obviously a suit, it doesn't even come close to what he claimed he created back in 1967. As expected in the Morris recreation, which is a costume, you can see folds and wrinkles. The arms are human-sized, and the face also looks like a headpiece made with a human in mind. The subject of the Patterson film is completely different. No folds or wrinkles, flat and elongated forehead, and extra long arms. Morris's claim is therefore dead on arrival. If Morris cannot recreate the suit he claimed to have made for the Patterson film, then we have no reason to believe that he made a costume for the Patterson film. But perhaps you're still unconvinced. Perhaps you might say that it's been so long and Morris is much older now, so his skills are not as sharp as before. While not exactly the best argument, let's agree that this is the case. Perhaps another group of experts with access to the right resources, technology, and skills could recreate the costume, right? Well, we've already seen that even in 2024, Hollywood still can't create that level of authenticity. But much more than that, the BBC actually attempted to accurately recreate the alleged costume used in the Patterson-Gimlin film. The experts tried to use resources and technology available in the 1960s, and here is the result of that. It's such a far cry from Patty on so many obvious levels that there's no point going over each one. Now, to the claims that the subject of the Patterson-Gimlin film wore a costume bulked up using football gear, this turns out to be obviously false once again, just by watching the film. One thing you'd immediately notice upon looking at Patty is that she has disproportionately long arms for her body. In fact, her arms are almost as long as her legs. This is obviously inconsistent with what we know about human physical measurements. But does this make Morris and Hieronymus's claims true? Not exactly. For one, the placement of the elbow does not allow for this possibility. Also, look at how the elbow flexes when Patty walks. This is obviously not the case of a bat being added to the costume. The creature in the film has very normal-looking arms, even if they don't look human, and these arms swing fluidly. There's none of the awkwardness you would expect if there were a man in there holding on to a football bat. So, once again, the claim that the subject was a man in a costume bulked up by football gear hardly holds water. Now that we've debunked some of the most commonplace objections to the Bigfoot theory, let's hear how believers make the case for their proposition. First, we're going to hear from Bill Munns. Munns is one of the foremost visual artists in Hollywood, with several impressive movies to his credit, like The Boogans, Swamp Thing, and The Beastmaster. Munns also has a huge collection of high-res copies of every single frame from the Patterson-Gimlin film. And what Munns finds is incredibly interesting. By the way, you can read more about it in his book, When Roger Met Patty. It's one of the most comprehensive analyses ever carried out on the Patterson-Gimlin film. But for the sake of time, we're only going to summarize the most important points. First off, Munns shows that there is no evidence of seams, which ought to be present if indeed this was a man in a costume. Secondly, there's no bunching up or wrinkling of fabric, despite how this alleged man in a suit flexes his limbs. Instead, we see muscles rippling. A really significant piece of evidence, though, is the head of this so-called costume. If indeed this was a costume, then the man who put it on would have had to undergo plastic surgery to fit into the headpiece, as the head slopes back in the forehead area, which human heads simply do not do. And what are the chances that a person would spend such a prohibitively expensive amount on plastic surgery just for a hoax? Almost zero. Of course, let's not forget the presence of mammary glands. Even to this day, it's extremely rare to find an ape costume that comes with breasts. People simply don't make costumes with any kind of sexual anatomy. Besides, even if a hoaxer wanted to step out of the norm and give their costume some form of sexual identity, most would naturally choose a male anatomy because it's scarier. However, the creature in PGF clearly shows 2 mammary glands, and the motion dynamics around that area are quite fluid, lessening the chances that this is just a costume. There are several more supporting points to consider that substantiate the Bigfoot theory, and a really big one is Patty's gait and foot tracks. Throughout the clip, Patty is hunched forward, and her legs never fully extend like those of a human. The angle of her shin to the ground is also unusually high, which does not seem apparent at first until you compare it with a normal human gait.
The angle of her shin rise is 73 degrees. We see it on every step. Now let's take a look at our model on the right. We see her shin rise only comes up to 52 degrees. So now we have this and this. 21 degrees difference. Big deal. No 2 shins are going to rise the same, right? 52 degrees, 52 degrees, again and again. Everybody hit the same mark. 52 degrees.
This walking step has still not been successfully replicated more than 50 years after the footage, despite lots of critical claims that the gait can be replicated. In fact, the odds of a human successfully replicating the Bigfoot walk for the length of time that the film runs is so low that it's pretty much impossible for all intents and purposes. This, therefore, rules out the possibility of multiple takes as well. Bob Hieronymus, who claims he was the man in the suit, has tried to replicate the walk before. However, an analysis of the footage proves that the 2 gaits aren't the same. But even beyond that, Professor of Biomechanics and Movement Neuroscience Jürgen Konzak tried to replicate the gait of the Patterson film subject using a tall athlete with the ability to perform a wide range of motion. The results were quite telling.
Around 5 feet, so we'll go a little further, we should be fine.
Dr. Konzak wants to see if this athlete is able to put his body into the seemingly awkward positions of the Patterson subject. If he can, then it is reasonable to assume the walk could be replicated, and it could be a man in a monkey suit. However,
if you look at this gait, I think we can clearly say it is not the walk of a large ape that we know today.
He said he doesn't walk like a human and he doesn't walk like an ape.
The athlete couldn't do it. He could not walk like whatever or whoever was caught on film.
It's becoming increasingly obvious that this is a real creature. Besides the obvious evidence that disproves the man in a suit theory that you find just by watching the film, there's also something that Hieronymus mentioned in his conversation with Long. So, talking to Greg Long, Hieronymus claimed that he couldn't see properly in the suit. In his own words, Hieronymus said, "Because the eye holes were a little more than an inch away from my face, it was hard to see in that mask." Now, keep that in mind and look at the footage again. I don't know about you, but to me, that does not look like the walk of a person finding it difficult to see ahead of himself. The stride is confident, and, in fact, the subject does not even stop moving when it does the look back. In such a wooded area with many obstacles, moving around in such a bulky costume with clown shoes and hampered sight is a recipe for disaster. Yet, this creature seems to be walking just fine, not even bothering to look where it is going. Which leads me to the mid-tarsal break. The mid-tarsal break is a bit complicated to explain. But basically, if an animal has a mid-tarsal break, it indicates that the foot flexes in the middle, which makes for easier and more efficient movement in uneven terrain. Now, animals like apes are known to have a mid-tarsal break, and admittedly, a very small percentage of humans also have this feature, called a floppy foot. But generally, the human foot is vastly different from an ape's foot. Ape's feet flex in the middle due to the mid-tarsal break. Human feet, on the other hand, flex at the front part. Now, take a look at the footprint Patty left behind in the Patterson-Gimlin film. As you can see, it clearly shows the mid-tarsal break, a feature that can't be faked by a human, no matter how hard they try. There are many logical inconsistencies that simply have to be held if we're to believe that the Patterson-Gimlin film was faked. For instance, it seems that Roger Patterson was nearly half a century ahead of his time. Let me explain. So, Patterson and Gimlin go into the forest with a highly expensive, ultra-realistic ape suit. Then, the best they can do is to record this ultra-expensive stunt on a 1967 Cinecam. Of course, the resulting video is grainy as heck, and no one can even see all the hyper-realistic details that the suit offers. In fact, it takes several decades, long after Patterson has passed on too, for us to see just how realistic the ape suit was. At this point, one has to ask themselves what Patterson and Gimlin's point could possibly have been from the start, because this makes little sense. And it's not just that. If this was really just a man in an ape costume, then when we finally had the technology to analyze the video, it should have yielded a laughable result. I mean, it happens all the time with claims of aliens and UFOs. Looking back, the laughability of these clips almost always becomes apparent in light of modern technology. But it's not the case with the Patterson-Gimlin film. In fact, quite the opposite has happened. With the passage of time and the advancement in technology, the footage has only looked increasingly more genuine. Besides, if this film was a hoax, then it has to be a hoax in a class of its own, because many other paranormal hoaxes have since been debunked. The Loch Ness Monster, for instance, has been debunked. So have the crop circles phenomenon, and the Cardiff Giant. In fact, about 10 years before Patterson's film, 16-inch footprints were discovered near Bluff Creek, but by 2002, the story report was debunked. So how come 60 years after its making, with dozens of experts analyzing each frame using the most sophisticated technologies, the Patterson-Gimlin film is yet to be debunked? Just how elaborate and sophisticated is this hoax that the only other logical alternative to believing that Patterson really did capture Bigfoot is to say that it remains inconclusive? Or are we maybe concluding too fast? While most skeptics agree that the Patterson-Gimlin film is a hoax, many skeptics will also acquiesce that judging from the video alone, it's impossible to prove their position. While believers have looked to enhanced and stabilized versions of the Patterson-Gimlin film to demonstrate evidence for the subject being Bigfoot, such as rippling muscles, skeptics remain firm that the video is much too grainy to say anything with the utmost sense of certainty. In fact, there have been quite a few key things about this film that can't be concluded definitively. For instance, the original film no longer exists, so all the analyses we've seen from experts have been based on copies of the film and not the original footage itself. As a matter of fact, there's no record that anyone anywhere ever had the original print. which is weird enough on its own. But here's the bigger issue. Without the original film, we don't have the original film's leader, which would have shown us the date on which the film was developed. The leader would have also shown if there were alternate takes, which would have helped to build the skeptical case for the Patterson film being a fake. Unfortunately, the original film no longer exists, so that line of evidence is also lost. So once again, there's no way to confirm anything in that department. Skeptics here therefore have to build their case not based on the film itself, but based on accounts from Patterson and Gimlin about the events of the day and the character of Patterson himself, which turns out to be quite shady. Let's begin with the duo's account of the events of that auspicious day. To begin with, let's go over the story again. So, Patterson developed an interest in Bigfoot, and then, one day in October 1967, he took his friend down to the forest in Northern California and proceeded to look for this creature that had captured his interest. By the most serendipitous stroke of luck, these men who had gone into the forest to find the elusive Bigfoot did just that. Super convenient, right? I mean, what are the odds? Anyway, as Patterson claims, one afternoon, while he and Gimlin are on a walk, the creature conveniently steps out of the woods and walks across the clearing. He and his partner Gimlin see the creature, start rolling, and then give chase to the creature on horseback, but they lose her. Luckily for them, there's such a thing as footprints, so they ride back to their camp to pick up some plaster of Paris. Mind you, this trip covers a distance of 5 kilometers. Then they ride back, pour the plaster into the tracks, wait for the casts to dry, and then make their way back to the campsite again. So a total of 15 kilometers covered so far on horseback. When they return to the camp, the two load their horses into Gimlin's pickup and then drive the 40 kilometers back to Willow Creek. I should probably mention that the roads were quite rough. Anyway, when they get to Willow Creek, they post the film to Yakima, where it's supposed to get developed. And then, by the very next evening, the film is fully developed and ready for showing at the home of Patterson's brother-in-law and sponsor, Al Atlee. Do you see the problem with this account? The timeline of events is difficult almost to the point of impossible. Patterson and Gimlin expect us to believe that they took the footage, went back to the campsite 5 kilometers away to get the plaster, returned to make the cast, then went back to the campsite, packed up, and moved down to Willow Creek to post the film off to Yakima for development at 4 in the afternoon. The timeline is not particularly beyond the realm of belief, but it is difficult enough to make their story a bit hard to believe. And it gets worse because Patterson and Gimlin also expect us to believe that a 16mm Kodachrome film got fully developed and ready for showing in less than 24 hours, when the standard turnaround time for developing 16mm film is 48 hours minimum. The holes in the story's timeline are really conspicuous, which was why skeptics got suspicious in the first place. But of course, Patterson and Gimlin tried to plug these holes, so they started to change their stories, with the duo claiming that they delivered the film to Yakima via plane, where Atlee picked it up and had it developed. Unfortunately, there are no records of any charter planes going out on that particular day, as all planes were grounded due to bad weather. These inconsistencies obviously weaken Patterson and Gimlin's claim about capturing Bigfoot. But that's the thing about this film. Even these objections still do not completely disprove the film. The major blow to Patterson and Gimlin's claims come from the person of Roger Patterson himself, and Greg Long's book does an exhaustive job uncovering a whole other side of Roger Patterson previously left untold. Alright, let's throw it back to some months before the world-famous film was shot. So in 1966, about a year before his lucky break, Patterson published a book titled Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist? This book plays an important role in the debunking of the Patterson-Gimlin film, so please pay attention. Anyway, between 1966 and 1967, Patterson had this idea of a Bigfoot documentary that he wanted to produce. He touted the idea all over Hollywood, but each studio he pitched to rejected the idea, until American National Enterprises decided to take it up. In fact, the camera Patterson used for his Bigfoot project was rented using A&E's money. Some also argue that it was A&E's money that bought the ape suit. And a retired executive of A&E did say that Patterson was employed by the company in 1967 to hoax a Bigfoot sighting to be used for the documentary the company wanted to produce. However, as it turned out, Patterson would double-cross the company, effectively stealing the famous Bigfoot film we now know as the Patterson-Gimlin film, which should legally have been A&E's intellectual property. Not only did Patterson hold the camera longer than necessary, to the point where the camera store had to press theft charges, Patterson also abandoned the documentary project after shooting his famous film, causing A&E to lose all of its investment. But Patterson's behavior is far from atypical, at least if Greg Long's sources are to be believed. Long's extensive book tells story after story of Patterson scamming literally everyone he met, from friends to family. In fact, based on eyewitnesses' stories, it's likely that Patterson ran a regular check fraud scheme, and also ran up huge bills which he then refused to pay. Now, what do you get when you sum up everything we've come to know about Roger's character so far? Well, we gather that he was a well-known crook, and he was definitely invested enough in Bigfoot to orchestrate a Bigfoot hoax. Which brings us to his book, Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist? Many believers often cite the presence of breasts on the creature as proof that this couldn't have been a man in a costume. But details from Patterson's book might give us reasons to reconsider that position, because in his book, Patterson depicts a drawing of a female Bigfoot that looks exactly like the Bigfoot in Patterson's video. If Patterson did this, then the argument that no one would go through all the trouble to fix breasts on an ape costume falls apart, because Patterson obviously had motive. Besides, the fact that Patty's mammary glands were furry also serves as a point in favor of the man in a costume argument, because furry breasts aren't a thing you see in the wild. Think about it. How would Patty feed her babies with furry breasts? Exactly. Still, on motive, the Patterson-Gimlin film was definitely not just a hobbyist project for Patterson. As already mentioned, Patterson allegedly stole the clip from A&E, the company that sponsored the documentary in the first place. But it wasn't just that. About 10 days after Patterson shot the film on November 1st, Patterson and DeAtley immediately formed a corporation, Bigfoot Enterprises. And from this film, the company recorded $200,000 in the first year alone. Not a shabby amount at all, right? Perhaps this was what Patterson wanted all along, which was why he orchestrated the hoax in the first place. Granted, taking each of these points on its own isn't sufficient to prove that the Patterson-Gimlin film was a hoax. However, when you take all of them together, from the near impossibility of the logistics involved in producing the film to the fraudulent character of Roger Patterson, we have more than sufficient reason to believe that the Patterson-Gimlin film was very likely faked, even though the film quality is too poor to make a definitive conclusion. But here's the thing. While that is true, even the skeptical theory is just as full of holes as the theory put forth by the believers. For instance, if this was really a man in a costume, what happened to the costume? How come none of Patterson's family and friends admitted to knowing about or being part of a hoax? I mean, all of them willingly conceded that Patterson was a colorful character, but none admitted to knowing about any hoax. Plus, it's true that Patterson made a lot of money from his film, but it's also true that he didn't spend any of the money he made on himself. D. Atlee, his brother-in-law, is reported as saying he didn't take any of the money he made and increase the standard of living for him or his children. He spent it all on proving it being Bigfoot. To be fair, some skeptics who are more sympathetic towards Patterson have claimed that Patterson faked the movie not for selfish personal reasons, but for the sake of his family's well-being. Patterson died 5 years after his film from cancer. By that time, his film had started drawing a huge sum in income, and his wife, Patricia, owned a significant portion of the film's rights, which meant a secure income for her for the rest of her life. Perhaps Patterson knew he was dying and faked the Bigfoot film as a way to ensure his wife was taken care of even if he died. Well, that's not impossible. But as kind as this proposition is, even this doesn't answer the bigger questions about the Patterson-Gimlin film. It doesn't bring us any closer to a conclusive solution to the Patterson-Gimlin controversy. I mean, wouldn't it be possible that Long himself was hoaxed by Bob Hieronymus, Philip Morris, and the other eyewitnesses he interviewed? They definitely had as much incentive to hoax as Patterson. For instance, Hieronymus claims he wasn't paid what he was promised for wearing the suit. But in the first place, believing that Patterson, a known no-gooder, had $1,000 to pay him for such a simple stunt is in itself highly suspect. For perspective, $1,000 in 1967 money is worth over $9,000 today. If someone told you they were willing to pay you that much for wearing a costume even for 24 hours, would you believe it? Especially if said person has never been known to hold down a job. But fine, let's grant that Hieronymus believed that for whatsoever reason. How come it took Hieronymus 37 years to expose Patterson after Patterson duped him of that money? Now add that both Hieronymus and Morris both made a ton of money from attending Bigfoot events and signing books, and you could easily see how both of them could have purposely hoaxed Greg Long. The point is, the Patterson-Gimlin film is one event that firmly earns its place in the realm of the unsolvable mysterious. Everyone from armchair researchers to top experts in their fields have tried, and we keep coming to the same conclusion. There's no way to know for sure. So, in the end, we're right back to where we started. Does the Patterson film show Bigfoot, or was this just a man in an ape costume? 57 years later, the jury is still out. By the way, if you'd love some more Bigfoot stories, here's a chilling account of how Bigfoot terrorized a town in Alaska called Portlock.